call Katrina Shanks.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's my pleasure to take a call on the second reading of the legislation bill today. I'd also like to acknowledge the recent passing of Mr Tanner and the work that he did in the Select Committee and in this House, and also on this piece of legislation to get it before Parliament today. This legislation bill is about modernising and improving the law relating to the publication, availability, reprinting, revision and official versions of legislation in one single piece of legislation. And this contributes towards our regulatory reform in terms of reducing the need for technical remedial legislation as a consequence of the enhanced reprinting powers. This also will improve our access to law through a program of revision of old statutes. So, as this bill has come from the Select Committee, it has taken a little while to get here to have its second reading. And it's good to see that the Minister's been working closely with Charles Chauvel in opposition to ensure that we do get agreement on this piece of legislation moving forward. It also went through, it's had two reports by the Law Commission, recommendations on how to improve this bit of legislation, and I know that the Select Committee worked very hard on it, and I'd like to acknowledge the role that they've played in getting it here today as well. So it does replace the Statutes Drafting and Compilation Act 1920. It replaces the Acts and Regulations Publications Act 1989 and also the Regulations Disallowance Act 1989. And it does allow for some key changes within this legislation. And that is there will be a 3-yearly program of systematic revision of these acts. And it will modernise the legislation by providing for the disallowance of subordinate legislation. It allows for the provision of enabling powers and related processes to certain types of subordinate legislation to incorporate material by reference. And it also updates aspects of the Statutes Drafting and Compliance Act 1920. And these are all quite these are all quite technical if you're not within the law. So I think this is a really good piece of legislation. This House of the rule of law. People need to be able to understand legislation, and courts need to be able to interpret legislation quite easily. So this is also about a plain English approach that has not always been the approach taken in Parliament before, and our legislation has been quite complex, especially some of our old legislation is quite hard to read. And one real shocker comes from the United Kingdom, contained in the Banking Act 1979, Appeals Procedure England and Wales, Regulations 1979. And this is what it says, and this is an example of how complex legislation can get, and it's not plain English at all. Any reference in these regulations to a regulation is a reference to a regulation contained in these regulations. I don't know what that means. I've read it about 10 times. I'm still not quite sure what it means. But it just shows you how complex we can write as legislators. And really we've got to think about who's reading this legislation and make it as easy as we can for people to pick up a bit of legislation and understand it. So this represents a significant step in the process of improving and modernising the New Zealand statute book. Mr Speaker, I commend this bit of legislation to the House.
The Honourable Leanne Dalzell.
Mr Speaker, I too rise to support the passage